I remember the dust first. Not the shouting, not the thundering of cannon, not the cries of men breaking under fire, but the dust. Thick and red and rising in billowing clouds behind thousands of feet, horses, and wagons, all fleeing the same direction. It hung in the air like smoke from a great fire, settling into our clothes, our mouths, our thoughts. Under the dying Virginia sun, it felt as if the road itself had become a living thing, swallowing us whole as we trudged north. The 1st Minnesota moved in loose columns, our formations stretched thin and broken after the rout. No drummer kept the pace now. No officer barked steady commands. The retreat had taken on a strange quiet, broken only by the haggard breathing of men who had run farther than they thought possible, and yet somehow believed the enemy was still at their heels. A private from Company G stumbled beside me, gasping as he clutched his canteen. "God help us! That wasn't what they told us it would be." I didn't answer. My own throat was too tight, and the truth weighed too heavy for words. We had marched out in the morning like the newspapers promised, confident, eager, certain of a swift victory. By afternoon, that certainty had burned away like fog before a rising storm. Ahead on the road, a broken caisson lay overturned, one wheel spinning slowly. A dead horse sprawled beside it, eyes still open as if watching us. No one stopped. No one dared. We were long past the point of stopping for anything. I kept my rifle slung across my shoulder, though my arms trembled each time it shifted. Powder still clung to my fingers. The battle's noise still echoed inside my skull, volleys cracking like lightning, shells bursting above us, officers shouting orders that dissolved in the roar. I had fired my musket so many times that the barrel felt like part of my body, though I'm not sure I ever truly aimed at anything beyond the smoke. Every so often, someone glanced south as if expecting gray uniforms to appear through the trees. Rumors swept through the column. The Confederates were advancing. Their cavalry was already upon us. They meant to sweep all the way to Washington. None of it mattered. We would have run even if no one had spoken a word. The sun dipped behind the tree-line, leaving the road washed in the dim gold of late evening. The shadows stretched long, and with them came a strange sort of calm, not peace, but a numbness settling over us like a damp blanket. Somewhere behind me, a man began to sob quietly. Somewhere ahead, another muttered a prayer. Others trudged on with blank stares, hollow as dried husks. As we neared Centreville, the road widened and the columns thickened. Troops from New York, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, all mixed together, uniforms muddied, faces pale. A wagon rumbled past carrying wounded men whose moans rose above the clatter of wheels. I recognized the sergeant from Company B lying in the back, his arm bound in a makeshift sling. His eyes met mine for a moment, and I could not tell if he recognized me or simply looked through me. We passed a group of civilians who had come out earlier to watch what they believed would be a spectacle, gentlemen in fine hats, ladies with picnic baskets, children waving flags. Now they stood in stunned silence as battered, limping soldiers streamed past them. One woman covered her mouth with a handkerchief. A boy lowered his flag. Someone said, "So much for 90 days." Someone else whispered, "This war will be longer than we thought." But most of us said nothing. The truth had settled too deeply for words. By the time we reached the ridgeline overlooking Centreville, the sky had dimmed to a purple haze. Fires flickered across the fields below, marking camps hastily formed by retreating regiments. Officers tried to restore order, to gather companies and call roll, but the retreat had scattered men across miles. Some wandered in long after nightfall, some would not return at all. I sank to the ground beside a rail fence, feeling my legs tremble with exhaustion. I had thought myself brave when I enlisted. I had thought fear was something a man could master through will alone. Yet that day had shown me a kind of fear I had not known existed, one that does not shout, but whispers. One that waits in the quiet moments when you are too tired to resist. As darkness fell fully over the ridge, I felt the weight of Bull Run settle into my bones. I knew, even then, that the war we had imagined, short, glorious, decisive, had vanished on that field. What lay ahead would be longer, harder, and far more costly. And though I did not yet know it, the march away from Manassas would mark the beginning of a different kind of journey, one not measured in miles, but in the slow reshaping of a man who had seen the truth of war for the first time. When we finally reached the crest above Centreville, darkness had settled so thickly that the fires below looked like scattered embers clinging to a dying hearth. The sky above was a deep, bruised blue, and the air held that heavy stillness that often follows great noise and great fear. Our retreat had slowed to a weary shuffle, and the officers called a halt, not because they wanted to, but because the men simply could not go any farther. I sank to the ground beside a rail fence, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The rails were rough against my back, but it felt good to be still, even if only for a moment. Around me the 1st Minnesota attempted to form into something resembling a line. The company sergeants moved through the mess, calling names, trying to count heads in the dim light. Their voices were hoarse, tired, sometimes cracking when a name went unanswered. Larson? Silence. Murphy? A faint, here, from somewhere in the dark. Evans? Only the crackle of a fire answered. Each missing voice hung in the air longer than the last. Corporal Jensen came to sit beside me, dropping his haversack with a grunt. Sweat had dried in streaks on his face, leaving pale trails through the dust. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and looked at the scattered fires below. "Reckon they'll come after us?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I answered, though the question had been gnawing at me since we left the battlefield. "Well," he said, "suppose we'll find out soon enough." A gust of night air drifted over us, carrying the mingled smells of sweat, burnt powder, and churned earth. My uniform still reeked of it, of the day we had left behind. I ran a hand over my rifle, feeling the rough stock in the cold barrel. Powder stained my fingers black. I wondered how many rounds I had fired, how many I had even aimed. The memory of the battle came in flashes, like lantern light, the smoke curling upward from the brush, the roar of volleys rolling across Henry Hill, the sudden, jarring collapse of our line. It felt impossible that only hours had passed since then. Across the camp, a few men were trying to start a fire with damp wood. The spark caught, then hesitated, then finally grew into a weak flame. Faces gathered around it, tired, hollow-eyed, smeared with dust and fear. One man began shaking uncontrollably. His friend draped a blanket over his shoulders without speaking. Another soldier, his hat lost somewhere on the road, stared at the fire without blinking, as if afraid that closing his eyes might bring back the sound of musketry. The officers did what they could. Some moved through the ranks, offering quiet words. Others barked orders, desperate to impose structure on the chaos. I saw Lieutenant Farrell standing near a lantern, staring at a crumpled map as though willing it to make sense. His hand trembled as he held it. Someone passed me a hardtack biscuit. I chewed it slowly, though my stomach had no desire for food. Hunger seemed like a luxury from another life. The coffee, if one could call the weak, gritty liquid coffee, tasted of ash and tin, but I drank it anyway. Warmth was warmth. Down the line, a few of the boys began murmuring among themselves. "They said it would be different," one man muttered. "They said a single charge would scatter 'em," another replied. A third shook his head. "Those weren't militia out there. Those were soldiers." The word hung heavily, soldiers. We were learning, fast and painfully, what the difference meant. Someone behind us began to hum a hymn, low and wavering. It faltered after a few notes. No one felt much like singing. No one felt much like speaking. We were all listening, to the quiet, to our own breathing, to the distant night for any sign that the Confederates had followed. A few artillery pieces were pulled into position near the ridge, their wheels creaking in the dark. The crews moved with hushed urgency, readying the guns for the worst. Their silhouettes shifted like restless shadows against the lantern glow. Jensen finally broke the silence between us. "You still thinking about the field?" he asked. "I can't seem to stop," I admitted. "Me neither," he said. "Feels like it's still under my boots." I nodded slowly. "I keep seeing that moment when the line broke." He said, staring into the darkness. "Sounded like the world came apart." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The night deepened, and the fires glowed softer, as though weary themselves. A few men lay down where they sat, too drained even to roll out blankets. Others walked aimlessly between the companies, searching for missing comrades, finding too few. When the bugle finally sounded taps, the notes drifted through the night like a kind of lament, thin, sorrowful, hanging in the air long after the final tone faded. It did not comfort so much as acknowledge the weight we all carried. I lay back against my pack and looked up at the faint stars through the drifting smoke. We had begun this war believing we would march into glory. We had ended the day learning how easily glory turns to dust. My eyes closed slowly, though sleep stayed far away. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though the earth itself had not yet settled from the shock of battle. And in that long, restless quiet, I felt the first true understanding of what lay before us, of how far we still had to march, and how little any of us knew of the trials to come. Morning arrived without ceremony. No glorious sunrise, no trumpets, just a pale, washed-out light creeping over the ridge, revealing a camp that looked as tired as the men within it. A light drizzle had fallen during the night, turning the dust into a thin paste that clung to our boots. The air smelled of wet wool and burnt powder. No one had slept well, if they slept at all. I pushed myself upright, muscles stiff, uniform damp and cold against my skin. My blanket was speckled with mud where I'd tossed and turned. Around me, the men of the 1st Minnesota rose slowly, like old men after a hard winter, each movement deliberate and subdued. No one spoke at first. Conversation required a kind of energy we hadn't yet found. Then came the call for breakfast. If the meal could be called that. Hardtack, the same unyielding square that could break a tooth if you didn't soften it first, was issued along with a small ration of salt pork. The pork was streaked with fat and salt crystals, wrapped in waxed cloth that smelled faintly rancid. We chewed it because the body demanded fuel, not because any part of us desired it. My tin cup held coffee, or something like it. The grounds floated on top of the lukewarm water, and the taste was closer to burnt rope than anything brewed. Still, I held the cup close, letting the rising steam warm my hands. Jensen nudged me with his elbow. "Eat. You'll need strength before long." "For what?" I asked. "No telling," he said, shrugging. "That's the trouble of soldiering. The waiting's the hardest part." He wasn't wrong. The battle had been terror, the retreat had been exhaustion. But this uncertain quiet, had a different kind of weight. All around us, men busied themselves with small, necessary tasks. Rifles were stripped and cleaned. Cartridge boxes inspected. Canteens refilled from barrels hauled up the ridge. The familiar routine brought order where none had existed the day before. I laid out my musket across my knees and began cleaning it. Powder residue clung to the interior of the barrel, thick and black. I ran the ramrod with a damp rag down its length, twisting slowly, thinking of each shot I'd fired on that field. Thinking, too, of how many I had wasted, fired blindly into smoke, muscles moving faster than my mind. The truth sat uneasily with me. Bravery alone did not make a soldier. We had marched out as volunteers, full of purpose. But purpose meant little against trained lines and steady volleys. Around us, snippets of conversation drifted through the camp like stray embers. "I heard they lost 2 entire batteries. They said the Confederates fought like devils. My brother was in the 69th. No word from him yet. We weren't ready. None of us." The voices carried different tones: fear, anger, disbelief, quiet resignation. But beneath it all lay a single, unspoken truth: the war we had imagined bore little resemblance to the one we had met. A young private, Larson, shuffled over to our small group, his face pale, hands trembling slightly as he tore at his hardtack. "Do you think they'll attack us here?" he asked, his voice low. Jensen shook his head. "If they meant to, they'd have done it last night." Larson swallowed hard. "I kept thinking, what if they come in the dark? What if they catch us scattered like this?" "That's fear talking," Jensen said gently. "It's loud after a fight. Give it time." Larson nodded, though I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He was barely more than a boy. Many of them were. They had gone into battle believing themselves invincible. The lesson learned at Bull Run had come swift and merciless. As the morning stretched on, an erratic mix of activities filled the camp. Some men wrote letters home, their pencils scratching across paper in hurried strokes. Others mended torn uniforms or patched blisters on their feet. A few simply sat, staring at nothing, turning over thoughts too heavy to share. I found my own thoughts drifting toward home, toward the Minnesota farm I had left only months earlier. The rows of wheat, the sound of wind through tall grass, the smell of fresh earth after rain. That life felt impossibly distant now, like the memory of someone else entirely. Had I truly been that boy? The one who thought war meant marching in formation, firing a musket, and returning home proud and unscarred? A part of me longed for those fields. Another part feared I would never see them again. By midday the drizzle tapered off, leaving the air damp but clearer. A supply wagon creaked into camp, drawn by a pair of weary-looking mules. Men gathered around as barrels of water were unloaded, along with sacks of flour and more hardtack. The routine of sustaining an army resumed as though the earth had not shaken beneath us the day before. Officers paced through the companies, giving instructions, asking after the men, attempting to impose structure on the formless exhaustion. Some of them tried to appear confident, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were just as shaken as the rest of us. And over it all hung the uncertainty. Would we march again? Would we fight again soon? Or would the enemy descend upon us before we had even regained our footing? No one had answers. We moved through the day the way a wounded animal limps toward water, slowly, instinctively, without knowing if danger waits nearby. As the sun edged higher, a thin warmth spread across the camp, though it did little to lift spirits. Routines continued, but they lacked their usual rhythm. We worked because the tasks were familiar, because familiarity steadied the mind, even when the heart felt unmoored. The battle was over, but its shadow lingered in every movement, every silence. None of us said it aloud, but we all knew the same truth. Something had changed at Bull Run. Not just the course of the war, but the men fighting it. We were learning, piece by painful piece, what it meant to be soldiers. It wasn't until the afternoon, after the routine chores were done, after the weak morning light had turned into a muted gray sky, that my mind finally settled enough to think clearly about Bull Run. Not the chaos of it, not the fear or the running, but the meaning of it. The truth of it. I found a quiet spot near the edge of camp, where a small rise overlooked the fields stretching toward the south. The grass there was bent with moisture, heavy with the remnants of the morning drizzle. I sat on an overturned barrel, musket leaning against my knee, and let my thoughts wander back into the smoke. The battle returned in fragments. Not in the order it had happened, but as scattered pieces, flashes of sky through drifting powder smoke, the crack of volleys rolling like thunder, the shock of seeing our line waver as if it were a living thing breathing in pain. Faces, too, men I knew only by name or company, suddenly contorted with fear or resolve. Some shouting. Some silent. Some praying under their breath as they loaded and fired. I remembered the heat of the barrel as I raised it again and again. The sting of powder in my eyes. The tightness in my chest as the Confederate line refused to break, even when we thought we had them on the run. Their volleys came with terrible regularity, as if timed by a clock. Ours less so. I realized, sitting there on that damp rise, how unprepared we had been, not only in skill, but in understanding. Back home, war had seemed a distant thing, shaped by stories of heroes and decisive charges. Men talked of patriotism as if it were armor strong enough to turn musket balls aside. Newspapers described the Union Army as an unstoppable force of righteousness. The talk in town squares, the speeches at enlistment rallies, they painted war as a trial of spirit, not of discipline. But Bull Run stripped away every illusion. It showed us the truth, that war was not waged by ideals alone. It belonged to men who drilled day after day, who learned to load and fire without thinking, who stood shoulder to shoulder even as the line shuddered beneath cannon fire. Men who knew how to keep formation when fear clawed at the back of their throats. The Confederates fought like that on Henry Hill. We had not expected it. Many of us believed they would break before we did. Instead, their lines held firm, reinforced by brigades that seemed to pour in from every direction. Jackson's men stood steady as stone, so steady, in fact, that the name, Stonewall, passed like a grim whisper through our ranks even before the retreat began. That memory unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I thought of that moment on the slope when our lines surged forward. I had felt the swell of hope then, brief but powerful, like catching sight of home after a long journey. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. The Confederate batteries tore into us. Their infantry rose from the smoke with a volley that cracked like a great sheet of ice. Our advance faltered. And in that faltering, the unraveling began. Too many green troops, I heard an officer mutter earlier that morning. He wasn't wrong. We were green, so green we hardly knew how to brace ourselves when the line gave way. Sitting alone, I turned that over in my mind. I had believed bravery would be enough, that standing tall, aiming true, and holding fast would conquer any enemy. But Bull Run taught me otherwise. Bravery without discipline is little more than noise and heat. A brave man firing wildly into smoke accomplishes less than a trained soldier whose hands move with practiced calm. This truth settled into me with a weight I could not shake. We had been proud volunteers, filled with zeal and certainty. Now we understood that zeal must be tempered. That certainty must yield to learning. That a soldier is not made by uniform or musket alone, but by the hard shaping of training and trial. My thoughts drifted to home again. Minnesota fields golden under summer sun, the horses moving slow and steady through the rows, the familiar rhythm of farm work. On the farm, mistakes cost time or labor. In battle, they cost lives. I realized how far I had come from that boy on the prairie, how quickly the last 2 days had aged me. I wondered if my family would recognize me now, if they would see in my eyes the shadow that Bull Run had left. A clatter of metal drew my attention. Down in camp, a group of men from Company U were cleaning their rifles in a circle, talking in hushed voices. "You think McDowell misjudged them?" one asked. "Misjudged? We all did," another replied. "They fought like they meant to end us. That's what an army is," a third said quietly. "We ain't won. Not yet." Their words echoed what I already felt deep inside. A breeze stirred the wet grass around me. I closed my eyes and listened, to the faint hum of camp activity, to distant artillery wagons creaking into new positions, to the low murmur of men whose confidence had been shaken to its core. The sounds were familiar yet changed. They belonged to an army forced to reckon with its own limitations. I breathed in slowly, letting the damp air fill my lungs. For a moment, I wondered what lay ahead. Would this defeat crush us, or forge us? Would we learn the lessons Bull Run had carved into us? Or stumble through more blood before we understood what it meant to fight as soldiers, not volunteers? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. But one thing I knew for certain. Bull Run was not merely a battle lost. It was the beginning of our awakening. As afternoon faded into evening, the camp at Centreville settled into a heavy, uneasy quiet. The drizzle had stopped hours earlier, but the air remained thick with moisture, clinging to our uniforms and hanging in the space between our words. Fires crackled here and there, small, flickering beacons against the approaching night, but even their light felt subdued, as if the flames themselves knew better than to burn too brightly after a day like Bull Run. I drifted back toward our company's fire, drawn more by the faint comfort of familiar faces than by the weak warmth it offered. A half-circle of men sat around it, hunched over as though trying to make themselves smaller. They spoke in low tones, their voices carrying the same dull weight that had settled over the entire army. Private Larson sat closest to the flames, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as if trying to divine some answer from the shifting embers. He didn't look up when I approached. "You holding up, Larson?" I asked quietly. He blinked, as though returning from some far-off place. "I think so," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Hard to tell." Jensen shifted on the log beside him. "None of us are quite right today. Won't be for a while." Larson nodded, running a thumb along the rim of his tin cup. He was young, too young to have seen what he saw yesterday, too young to carry the images he now held. But then again, many of us were. The war had not waited for age or experience. It had simply reached out and claimed whoever stepped forward. A few of the men were passing a small pot of coffee around, stronger than the morning brew but still tasting of burnt grounds. When the cup reached me, I took a sip. Bitter but grounding. The warmth steadied my hands. Someone across the fire broke the silence. "You think they'll write the truth in the papers?" A murmur rolled through the group. Newspapers had been full of boasts and certainty before the battle. Now, no one knew what they would say. Jensen snorted. "They'll write whatever keeps folks cheering back home." Another man added. "Probably say we almost won, if not for some mishap or another." Larson looked up. "But we didn't almost win." The fire popped sharply, sending sparks swirling. "No," I said. "We didn't." The men fell quiet again, and in that quiet, memories crept back, unwelcome but persistent. Faces blurred by smoke. The thud of musket balls tearing into the earth. The awful moment a man beside you falls, and you realize there's nothing you can do, not for him, not for yourself, not for anyone. One of the older volunteers, Thompson, cleared his throat. He had a voice like gravel being turned by a plow. "Back in '48, when I fought down in Mexico, we had regiments so drilled they could fire volleys in the rain without missing a beat." He stared into the fire a moment. "This army, well, we ain't there yet." Larson shifted uneasily. "Think we ever will be?" Thompson scratched his beard. "That depends if we learn from what happened yesterday." His words hung between us, heavy as cannon shot. A faint breeze moved through camp then, carrying the low rumble of distant wagons and the occasional shout of an officer. Somewhere further down the ridge, a bugler practiced a call, the notes wavering in the damp air. It sounded lonely, somehow, like even the music wasn't sure of itself. The fire beside us crackled softly, giving just enough light to see each other's expressions. Exhaustion etched itself deeply into every face. Fear lurked in the eyes of the younger men. Reflection in those of the older ones. None of us knew what the coming days would bring, and that uncertainty gnawed at us more than hunger or cold ever could. Larson spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought bravery would carry me through." Jensen looked at him gently. "Bravery gets you onto the field." I finished the thought aloud. "Discipline keeps you alive on it." Larson nodded, swallowing hard. He wasn't alone in needing to hear those words. Truthfully, I needed to hear them myself. The conversation drifted then, not toward tactics or blame, but toward the men we had marched beside. Someone mentioned Sergeant Vaughn and how calm he had been under fire, even as the line buckled. Another spoke of Corporal Adams, who had carried a wounded comrade halfway back before collapsing himself. These memories, these small acts of courage amid chaos, brought a quiet strength to the circle. Not pride exactly, but something steadier. Something that reminded us we had not run alone. As the sky darkened fully, and the first stars flickered faintly above the smoke-hazed horizon, the talk grew more subdued. Men leaned back on packs or stretched out on the damp ground. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows across the mud. Nearby, someone began humming a tune, soft, slow, familiar. "Shall we gather at the river?" It drifted across the camp like a sigh. Jensen broke the quiet one last time. "We'll get another chance," he said. "And next time, we'll be ready." I nodded, though the truth of it felt far away. Still, the words were something to hold on to as the night deepened around us. Up on the ridge, with the camp settling into uneasy rest, I felt the weight of the day pressing harder than ever. Bull Run was behind us, but it had left its mark, etched into our thoughts, our conversations, and the silence that followed them. The night felt long. And the war, longer still. Night settled thickly over Centreville, the kind of night that feels older than the day before it. Fires dimmed to faint embers across the ridge, and most of the men had lain down upon their blankets, though rest came slowly. The air held that heavy, wet stillness that follows rain, and each breath tasted of smoke and mud. I lay there among the others, staring up at a sky veiled in low clouds, thinking of the unknown road ahead. Somewhere down the line a man talked in his sleep, softly at first, then with a sudden gasp that startled those near him. A nightmare, no doubt. Several men had already woken shivering, calling out names of comrades left on the field. No one laughed, nor teased them for it. Bull Run had left each of us with our own shadows, and we carried them close. I pulled my damp blanket tighter around my shoulders. The small warmth of the dying fire nearby barely reached me, but even its faint glow gave comfort. In its light I could make out the silhouettes of my fellow infantrymen, Larson curled on his side, trembling occasionally, Jensen lying flat, hands folded behind his head, eyes open and thoughtful, Thompson snoring faintly, exhaustion outweighing fear. My body ached, but my mind would not quiet. I thought again of home. In Minnesota, the harvest would come soon. My father would be checking the fields each day, judging the grain by its color, by how the heads bent in the wind. The sound of crickets would rise from the grass after sunset, and the warm scent of hay would drift through the barn. I could picture it all so clearly that for a moment it felt nearer than the sleeping soldiers around me. Yet even the memory brought no peace. I was no longer certain who I would be should I ever return. A part of me felt older, stretched thin. Another part felt strangely hollow, as if something had been taken from me on that Virginian slope and left buried in the red soil. The murmuring of voices nearby pulled me back to the present. Two men whispered as they shared the last of their coffee. "You think they'll reorganize us?" one asked. "No question. They can't send us back out as we are. What of McDowell? Here he's lost the confidence of Washington. They're saying a new general's coming. A strict one." Larson turned slightly, his voice small. "Do you think he'll make soldiers out of us?" No one answered him immediately. At last I spoke into the dimness. "I expect he'll try. But the rest is up to us." The words sounded older than I felt. Discipline. That had become the heart of every conversation since our retreat. The officers knew it. The men felt it. Bull Run had torn away all the illusions of quick victories and easy glory. War was a craft, like farming, like carpentry, one learned by repetition, by patience, by sweat and failure. We had endured our first great failure. Perhaps from it, we could learn. A distant boom echoed faintly across the hills, maybe a gun being repositioned, or a caisson rolling over uneven ground. Every man near me tensed. Some sat upright. The memory of battle lay so close beneath our skin that even harmless noises stirred dread. But no alarm followed, and slowly the men settled again, some muttering curses under their breath at their own jumpiness. I lay back once more and let my gaze slip toward the horizon. The fires of other regiments dotted the night like fallen stars. All those thousands of men, blue uniforms darkened with rain and sweat, faces lined with smoke and fear, shared the same questions, the same uncertainty. Would we march again soon? Would we face those same gray lines before we'd had time to learn what we lacked? Would the Confederates press their advantage and drive north toward Washington? Rumors had flown like sparrows all day, but none held weight enough to calm or panic us. We were caught between possibilities, stranded in the quiet that follows a storm but precedes another. I exhaled slowly. "How long do you think this war will go?" I asked Jensen, though I wasn't sure he was awake. After a moment he answered, his voice low and steady. "Longer than any of us thought when we signed up." I nodded in the darkness. "That's my fear." "It ought to be," he said. "War's no short thing. Not when both sides believe they're right. Not when neither intends to yield." The fire popped softly, sending a small puff of sparks drifting upward. They hung in the air briefly before fading into the night, like brief lives snuffed out too soon. Jensen spoke again. "But there's something else too." "What's that?" "Bull Run showed us how green we are. But we survived it. Not all of us, but enough. And surviving means we get another chance." His words settled over me like a thin blanket, light, but warming, reassuring in ways I had not expected. Men shifted again, trying to find some comfort on the uneven, soggy ground. It occurred to me how strange it was to be surrounded by so many and yet feel so utterly alone within my own mind. Perhaps that was part of soldiering too, learning to carry fears quietly, to steady oneself even when others could not. Eventually, fatigue overcame even the thoughts that clung to me. My eyes grew heavy, and the murmurs around me blurred into a low hum. Just before sleep took hold, I whispered a thought, not quite a prayer, but something like it. "Let us learn what we must. Let us become better than we were yesterday." The fire burned low, the night deepened, and at last I drifted into uneasy rest.